Hello, I am Chris from Airwindows, and here we are doing another Q&A session. And it might be an interesting one. We'll see how this goes. Don't mind me fooling with some of this stuff and muting the screen so I don't have to look at it. So yeah, the title that I've chosen for today's Q&A session is grep. And there's a story behind that. As soon as anybody shows up, I may very well tell it. But I also am here trying out some new things and some experiments. So we'll see how all of this rolls. I guess I see that I am broadcasting. Seem to have a acceptable K per second. And I'm not encoding as hard as I really could, but that's fine. And strangely, hey Bo, strangely I look different on the YouTube screen than I do on OBS, but whatever. These things are mysterious. So yeah, our topic is grep, and that's because that's a little story that I'm going to tell you about some things I've been doing on Reddit and weird experiences I've been having. But I've also got a new thing to show off. Check that out, new camera, hey. So I'm actively working to get towards where I can do soldering and do the electrical work that I was wanting to do and be able to stream it. I feel like we're getting there. I feel like that is coming into focus. Although when we talk about focus, and come to think of it, I'm a little disheveled. Check this out. Hi. I forgot to bring the screen on. There you go. So, yeah. So I'm calling this stream grep. And there's a reason for that. I got into a discussion with somebody on a Reddit group. Reddit's a weird thing. Reddit is like the next step from like 4chan or whatever, but it's also kind of like the old news groups back in the day. Like when I was younger, over 10 years ago, the very beginnings of the internet, when I was on a 33 megahertz, 64K one-piece Macintosh, because that's what you had back in the day. Hey, Eddie. I was on Usenet, and Usenet was basically just a whole bunch of text posts. It's strangely like Reddit in that rather than having subreddits, you had news groups, and you would download new posts and stuff, and rather than being sort of threaded, you just kind of got a list of stuff. And I think YouTube failed you because there most certainly is a plug, and it was kind of interesting. The plug that I did, and it should be on Airwindows. In fact, I can take a moment to just peek over, see if it showed up on Gearslots or whatever. Nobody responded to it on Gearslots, but the post is there. And the YouTube video is there because I connected it to the post. There is most definitely a plug. And it is another Dither reissue. It turned out more interesting than I expected, because rather than just being kind of boring, if you start bit crushing this one, it turns into a really aggressive, harsh, strange brightening effect. Because it's essentially Studio 10. It's the the brightening factor of dither timbers, which is the darkening factor of the same principle. And all of these are better done by dark. All these are better done by Airwindows Dark, but this was an earlier, like at least a year ago, if not more, attempt of the same thing. And so Raw Glitters is the first of the two to be reissued. And Raw Glitters turned out to have more interesting interactions with the DRes control than I expected. But apart from that, it's the same deal. It's the dither reissue. And that's pretty straightforward. I thought it was going to be very boring and just a maintenance release. It turned out to be somewhat more interesting than that. So yeah, I was talking about grip. The reason I mention this is because on Reddit, I was drawn into this discussion on the filmmakers subreddit, which is quite interesting. Filmmakers subreddit, I get to have a special status because I am a working sound technician. In fact, I am a, I'll tell you in a moment. It's like dark in that it is a dither and it is choosing to pick the brightest of the two options for whatever is happening. So it's another non-dither. It's another choosing to do truncation in a particular way to get a result, and it always picks the most bright option between two adjacent samples, like the sample on one side, the sample on the other side. It'll always pick what makes things brighter rather than less bright as far as the direction that it truncates in, and that's all it does. So to get back to grip, I was on the filmmakers subreddit, and people were talking about, there was some kind of meme thing that somebody had put up. There were some weird qualities about this meme thing as well, because it was some dumb thing, and the A's in the image had some kind of peculiar characteristic, and people were going like, oh, I wonder what that's about. Oh, that bothers me. It bothers my OCD or whatever. And it's an interesting question. It's like, I'm not sure what happens when you have people putting across just ideas, putting across attitudes or impressions. But a guy got in, they were talking about like, well, it's too bad with the coronavirus stuff, how we're not getting to do as many productions and we're limited, and they're having to leave off things like electricians and grips and like director of photography, who knows, like you couldn't get as many people working on a film production that you previously could. And this one guy chimes in and he's going like, oh, well, they should leave off the grips because those guys are useless. You know, if you have to decide between like, I don't know, something or other, or the grips, then you definitely, and I thought that was odd. I was like, wait a minute, that can't be right. He's acting kind of copying an attitude. And it's like, hang on, what even is a grip? So I go and look. I think it was like, I think that if you had to choose between ditching the sound guy and the grip, you would always ditch the grip because they were useless. And I'm going, wait a minute, hang on. That doesn't, I'm a sound guy, but that doesn't sound right. And I go and look up what a grip is. A grip builds tracks for dollies and stands for cameras and trusses for high up cameras and things. Does some mechanical work on stuff. Makes sure that the crap doesn't fall down. Builds, I'm not sure exactly how much they do of all of that, but I went, okay, I've just looked this up. That seems kind of dumb. No, I don't agree. Because grips have a very important job in that if that went wrong, you'd be really sad because a $70,000 camera would go splat. So you're out of your mind. No, grips are not disposable. And it started an argument. And the guy just kept doubling down, being like, I don't know why you're defending these people. It's ridiculous. There's no talent. There's no skill in any of it. And I'm like, are you kidding? I have to be the grip for my own scenario. Like, here, boom, camera. This camera is on a microphone stand that has a microphone holder with a special little, it's difficult to describe even what I've built here. I'm a really sort of ghetto mad scientist grep, and I have made strange assemblages of stands and things. And yet I have to make this thing and be sure that it's not going to dump my camera on the ground. And I take that stuff seriously. Like, my other camera is on another bizarre conglomeration of stuff to hold the camera up, but I still worked really hard to figure out, is this going to be reliable? Is this bizarre Frankenstand that I'm building in order to be able to do my stuff going to collapse one day and hurt my cameras and such? And I took that seriously. I'm like, I don't want my stuff to break. I'm making camera stands, yes, but I have to do them properly. Much like with microphone stands. I got a microphone here, and the microphone stand also has to be done properly. So I'm arguing like crazy with this guy, and he just keeps on. It ended up being like, I bet you're also a guy that is completely horrible to wait staff when you go out to restaurants. Because he had this thing going on where, in a way, he was just sort of shit-stirring. He was just kind of, not to use rough language, in a way, he was just being a jerk. And the thing about it is, it seemed sincere, like he was genuinely offended and upset that I thought there was any importance to grips. And I'm explaining, no, you're not getting it. These are positions of responsibility and need to be done properly. And if they're doing their jobs wonderfully, it seems as if nothing could possibly go wrong because they haven't screwed up. And if you don't see the value in somebody being able to function reliably and show up when they're supposed to show up and build stands and equipment and tracks for dollies and things like that are reliable, and dude was like, yeah, this job, they just snapped the stuff together. It's like righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, what's the deal? Stop defending them. And I'm going, no, you don't understand. If you don't respect the challenge of something like that, even if it's not super difficult, it's like, not everything is about being super difficult. You want somebody to show up and do the right thing predictably and reliably when they're building tracks for your $70,000 camera. You don't want any surprises. It's supposed to seem boring. They're supposed to make it look easy. But if you're fooled by that, you will think that any bozo, any muppet can do it, at which point you don't see the point of hiring somebody, like it's a unionized job and stuff, where you're hiring somebody that has like a reputation or is asking money or something like that, and you'll go looking for Muppets because you can't see the difference. And then your camera will fall over and you'll just be mad at the grip or whatever. But that's why I called this particular Q&A grip, is because I had that little encounter. Was also butting heads with people on another subreddit. It's a subreddit by the name of BreadTube, which I thought was quite interesting because there's a number of different YouTubers that I quite like, and they fall into this category. I wonder if I get into my building gear and teaching people how to do it, that I get to be BreadTube too. I don't know. I think you'd have to rant about politics a lot more. I'm not sure if I directly do that. It's kind of implicit in some of the stuff that I choose. So we'll just say that. So what I should do here, I think, is scroll up a little bit, seeing as we're now about 15 minutes in, and see if I got actual questions and such. So Bo's still trying to figure out how the glitter thing works and how does the noise get trebly. It's not creating overtones in the sense of a distortion plugin. Instead, it is just picking whatever is most trebly at any given moment. And I can probably draw a thing and put it on the new camera. So maybe I'll see whether I can do that. And Ahmet is, you're trying unique music theories. That's always cool. It's like you got to try stuff. Maybe it won't actually lead to anything, but these false paths, that's part of the job. That's part of the issue. Tuning more on prime numbers to generate more tension and release. I'm not sure that's a musical thing, but it might be. I don't know. Yeah. It's an interesting idea. I feel as if, like, talking about choosing prime numbers to tune to, essentially what you're doing is exactly what you say. Pure tension and tension without any release ever. Like if you're picking only prime frequencies in whatever sense, then what's going to happen is you're doing the opposite of like just intonation. You're picking a kind of intonation in which all of the notes are maximally inharmonious with each other. So if that's what you're after, that's not a bad idea as far as how to do it. Like you could try to pick frequencies that are prime number cycles per second. And in so doing, you can guarantee that they will never be harmonious with each other. And basically what it's going to sound like on a subtler grain scale or on a larger grain scale is note sequences or harmonies that are always out of tune with each other. I do wonder whether maybe doing a prime number way of doing this is just going to more trouble than it's worth, because you could just tune everything wrong and then you'd more or less have that. Except for that if you were playing stuff on a fretted instrument, then the stuff on the fretted instrument, unless you messed with the intonation as well, would also be within a equal temperament of itself, which is not quite harmonic all the time, but it's also not as inharmonic as maybe the prime number tuning thing would be. So yeah, well, one thing we could do is try going to our fancy camera stuff. What you see here is a couple of things. This is a teensy. This is the thing that the chord organs and stuff runs on. So it's a small device. Go way out of focus if I lift it up. There's the underside, there's the overside. We've got our little USB connection here. If you plug a USB cable into this right now, it'll turn on and light up. And I think it'll light up. I'm not sure if it has a light in it or not. I feel like it does. I feel like it has a blinky light in there somewhere. And this button tells it to load a new programming from the USB. And this is what runs the chord organs. It can also run any number of different things. It has one 12-bit output that can go up to about 340 kilohertz sampling rate. So it's good at avoiding aliasing. It's about a $12 thing. This is TNC 3.2. And one of these pins on the end is where the analog comes out. And then lots of these other pins that you can solder into, you can get digital outs and things in there. Oh, quick answer. LQ2 is asking, is the dithering part of the new raw glitters plugin the same as Studio 10? Yes. Yes, it is the same as Studio 10 option in Studio 10. Next week you're getting, unless I have some completely unexpected thing, next week you're getting Dither Me Timbers, which is literally the opposite behavior. And that's also going to be the same as the respective thing in Studio 10, but with the switch and with the DRes control. And we'll see what the DRes control does with that one. So yeah, that's a Teensy. This is even cheaper than a Teensy. This is a something or other. It's a Adafruit Trinket is what that one is. I wonder if I can, just a second while I switch OBS over here. If I do this, I can actually see what the screen is showing. And I've done this because I have paper and pen, so I can draw the thing about the other question. We'll see how well that works. Be using much smaller images. But yeah, that being a Adafruit, this is more like a $8 or so thing. By the way, I'm open to learning better about how to do this. I've got this picture-in-picture thing going on. It's running off of the ATEM, and I realize I'm extremely tiny in the corner there. So if we don't like that, I can make it be bigger. It kind of has to stay the same aspect ratio because this is not inside OBS anymore. This is off of the actual hardware. But yeah, this is a Adafruit Trinket. And it's a tiny, tiny little boy, but it is also USB in that you plug your USB cable into there and use an Arduino style programmer to program it, and then you have a smaller number of these inputs and outputs, but it's another thing kind of similar. Like the Teensy is a wee bit more expensive and it's a wee bit larger, but it's capable of more. It's capable of being like a drum synth or at least a sample player, because that's what the radio music is capable of doing that. Not perfectly, but it is. And this one is smaller, slightly cheaper, fewer things, and it might be able to do sort of logic operations or being a sequencer trigger kind of deal. You could make it be your clock. Or you could make it do complicated math with trigger inputs and things. And as I keep going, like I've got a rather large page, which I've been writing down some of my notes on how we do this because I've got all of this perf board here. And this is part of what I'm trying to move towards, is figuring out how we can put these electronic parts onto these little guys and solder them on camera so you can see how to solder properly and build stuff, because I feel like it's interesting. I've been talking about this for ages and ages, and my progression through all these things is stuff like getting a Teensy, figuring out how to put it on, and wire it up, figure out how to get power to all of this. This colorful thing is a whole other story. Like this is a potentiometer. These are the legs of it. And it would be a matter of using those as your controls so that you have some ability to turn dials and knobs and stuff, but these are incredibly cheap compared to the real size, the full size ones. And then the colored area is two different experiments that I thought that I would show off. And it is, on the one hand, I got one of those packages of Sharpie markers. So if you take all the different color Sharpie markers that you can get and color the perf board with Sharpie markers, this is what you get. I feel like it's not all that exciting, but it does actually make colors. So that's one way of decorating the stuff that you build. And then in the middle, that is aluminum tape. You can get aluminum tape fairly easily. And yeah, EasyKB, if I am not mistaken, you can indeed do rough DSP with stuff like this. I'm less certain that you can do it with the Teensy because the Teensy has a 12-bit output, which is already kind of sketchy, but I do not know whether it has good input. I know that you can get control voltages into it, but I am not at all sure that it reads the control voltage at a useful frequency. But these are the kinds of things that you can do, and you can do stuff with those. It would be very rough DSP. Honestly, the reason I'm digging into these is because I feel like it's possible to get folks playing with hardware rather than only having to do DSP. If you were really focusing on DSP, it would be better to do that in the DAW and be work with my open source stuff rather than diving into this other stuff. So yeah, the other experiment that I have is I tried to see whether you could do good stuff with Sharpie markers to color perf board. Like here is a little stack of perf boards. This is the kind of stuff I mean to be making available to people. This is why I keep going on about this stuff. I can send off little boxes so long as like the US Post Office exists and provides this particular size of box that contain a large chunk of perf board that you can make into these. And the reason I would specify these is because this size is exactly the size for a 4 HP Eurorack module. And putting the Teensy aside, these are markings that I've made on this that illustrate what you'd do if you were putting together something where you're starting with just some pieces of perf board and some parts. The idea is that you need to be able to start with just these very, very basic things. Like you can get transistors and stuff for cheaper than you would imagine. You can get some of these parts like the chips that you use to do various things. Like the tube sound fuzz stuff. I could wire up a tube sound fuzz circuit using this 4049 chip that costs like 39 cents on one of these. And if you design it in such a way that you're using this shape, or indeed a related shape, like this shape is exactly the same height because that's important, but this is more along the lines of a 10 HP Eurorack module. If you filled this up, you could still fit it onto a Eurorack synth, but while you don't have a Eurorack synth, it's possible to take pieces of like pine board and build a box where you... Just a moment. I just realized that I have a example thing that I failed to show. Be right back. I'm stepping carefully around some of these things. I don't think it would be a very good grip because in setting up my camera stands and things, there's some wires hanging around. So I have to be careful not to stumble over them and smash everything. But if you were beginning to do this sort of thing, say you want to learn how to make hardware, you know that these chips are only 39 cents, you know that you can get transistors for very cheaply and so on. You can get pieces of perf board because ordering one big old slab of perf board costs about $7, but I should be able to get people a fairly decent sized chunk of this for cheaper than that, especially when you can buy it like a giant slab of this stuff it gets more expensive really fast if you're buying small pieces of it. If you're buying it in like a stack of 10 giant slabs that you'd have to cut up in order to be able to put into boxes and send to people, the price starts going down when you order in volume, and that's the whole point of what I'm doing here. If you make a wooden box, something out of pine wood or whatever, and set it up so that the inside space of this box is exactly between these two lines on the edges, then what you've built will also fit into a Eurorack system. You drill a hole where this dot is, and you drill a hole where this dot is, and carefully expand it because it'll crack if you're not careful. But if you have the facility to do that, and it might require having a drill press or something, that might be when you get serious. But if you have the capacity to do that, you can screw this into a full-fledged Eurorack system, get power out to it somehow, and run it, use it. So that means stuff that you build in this way can be adapted into these larger, more complicated systems that have the facility to take professionally made modules and stuff. You get to play with all of the different toys, and that's a trap, but it's also great fun. But before you do that, if you have the pine or any kind of wood, I think pine just because it's soft, boxes where you could, say, do 2 banks of it, say, and the pine board is, say, about as big as this teensy is, and you fit them with the board fitting between here, you can make a wooden hand-built thing. I'm going to be demonstrating this more as I go forward, so I'm trying to explain what it will be, even though I don't have it yet. And then you take a simple thumbtack. This is a thumbtack. This is a thumbtack. This is a fancy thumbtack. And you don't have to drill a hole. All you have to do is break the perf board into the correct sized pieces. Let's go to the other camera. It goes like this. You built your things on these little substrates. Keep it within this space and don't go out farther than this close to the edge. And then when you have it in your box, you take a thumbtack, put it through one of the holes, and it will fit just perfectly. Poke it into the wooden rails that you've made, and now you don't have to buy Eurorack rack rails, which are insanely expensive, and you don't have to buy Eurorack screws, Eurorack nuts, Eurorack sliding nut rail things so that they're all the correct spacing. You get to start building this kinds of stuff, including things like the Teensy, which is the guts of a lot of interesting modules, but it only costs $12 to buy one of these. And you can get a hold of this material for not too terribly expensive and build stuff. Also, you'll notice the holes line up. Let's see how close I got. Boop. And I might not want to force the thumbtack straight through this hole, but the holes in the Teensy line up with the holes in the perf board because that's how they're designed. It's 10 holes per inch. And that means, and that's what's exciting to me about this process, the ability to put together insane cool little hardware devices without having to have a full machine shop and the access to tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tooling and ability to do stuff. I'm talking handmade, I'm talking handcrafted synthesizer stuff. And the neat thing about it is if you're using the correct like IC sockets for interconnects and the correct wire, and I'm getting that as well. I'm getting a collection of this correct size of wire that you can get. Then your individual connections, even though it's miniaturized, like something like this, go over here, something like that, and literal IC sockets for patching stuff together, and I believe it is 20 gauge solid core steel wire to make your connections. Now you don't have to get jumper cables either. You do that, and now you don't have to buy cables. Now you don't have to buy jacks. If you're okay with the potentiometers here, your potentiometers can be about 15 cents. Normally that would be like $15. Maybe not quite as much of that. Depends upon how big of a knob you needed to get. But if you were going to get full-on, full-size potentiometers and real knobs to go on them, those are in the dollars each. And if you were going to have like 10 or 100 controls on your whole synthesizer, it quickly starts becoming unreasonably expensive. But if you're doing it in this insane solder core way, those are 15 cents each. You can get many more controls out of there. Then, here's a further exploration. Like this is my reference for color coding for perf board builds. This is not necessarily what I'm going to stick with, but it's my initial exploration. Let's darken the aperture down. Secret briefcase, because this was all about initially getting this kind of stuff, and I have this briefcase, which I still have, and I was going to put planks of pine wood in there and start building synthesizer parts onto it. It's literally what we're talking about here. So I was going to go like color code things for red for gates or pulses or square waves, yellow for inputs of whatever kind, green for triangle or ramp waves because that's a separate part of the circuit and it's you can get that out of the circuit. Green for if you wave folded the triangle wave into a sine wave, and that's something that you can do with that tube sound fuzz circuit I've been telling you folks about. Whites for mixes, pads, and blends. Black for ground. But do you want to do it with just Sharpie markers, or do you want to do it with this? This being literal vinyl electrical tape that I found on Amazon. And I'm going to try to get more of it because I feel I can get a bunch of rolls of this and then kind of stretch it out and layer all the colors on top of each other, wrap them around, and be able to give people just a couple of feet of this, because the idea is not to use the tape to hold stuff together. It's actually not great at that. This tape has very mixed reviews on Amazon, and I have other things have been happening around Amazon lately too that I can tell you about. But this tape has gotten poor reviews from some people because it's not very good as tape. It's sticking on to the perf board real nicely. I was expecting much worse, actually. But if you like stretch it and try to use it to tape things to other things, it will come loose because the adhesive is not great. The adhesive kind of doesn't really work very well, and it's very sketchy. But this particular manufacturer, one of the manufacturers selling stuff on Amazon, chose to make vinyl formulations with really good colors on them. Like, I am so pleased with how well these colors work. which means you can build your homebrew Eurorack-sized build your own synthesizer stuff for insanely dirt cheap, and then label things by putting bits of vinyl electrical tape on, meaning that you'll have materials that are not like using the Sharpie markers and, at some angles it has half decent colors, and other angles it's just garbage and doesn't look good at all and you can't see it. If you're using this material, you can put little dots of color anywhere you want on the synthesizer that you build, be able to see what you're doing, and unless it falls off, and if you're worried about it falling off, you can super glue it down and then it will never ever fall off. Unless it falls off, you'll be able to see what goes to where. And you can use multiple colors of wire. And the great thing about that is I can roll this stuff into my plans for putting this stuff into people's hands, letting you be able to order a little box, and in the little box is like $12 or $16 worth of just all the raw stuff that you would need. All you'd need is a soldering iron and some solder, and then you could start following along at home. And being able to make a big, complicated synthesizer without being in the hole for hundreds of dollars just for the parts. Because I feel as if that's wrong. Like, in a world where you can get this little thing and plug it into a USB and your computer, because you got to have a computer, otherwise you're not watching my YouTube video. Or if you are, then you're watching it off of a cell phone, and I would want to help you get stuff together even more. But you can get this for just like $8. It just feels like it's important to get people able to start experimenting with this stuff in such a way that they can make something cool and non-trivial and interesting if they can think their way through it. If they can think their way through following these steps and putting together, say, a circuit on a piece of board like this that, say, a distortion pedal or an oscillator or a sequencer, I could do all of those in a relatively short period of time. All of those just naturally come out of these chips and things. That's what they're for. That's what they do. And the sticking point for me is these extraneous things. Like, you can do this and you have to buy a Eurorack enclosure, hundreds of dollars right away. You have to buy the correct power supply. You have to buy cables to hook everything together. That also becomes hundreds of dollars really, really, really fast. And this is dismaying to me. I'm not happy about that part. And I think people should be able to do interesting creative stuff that is not lacking. And they shouldn't just, they shouldn't be stuck with just like VCV Rack or whatever. I mean, that's fine, but in order to do VCV Rack properly, you have to have a fairly hefty computer. So there you go. Again, this all gets exclusionary, and I don't like that part. So yeah, that's where I stand with this stuff, is putting together these designs and figuring out how to do these various things. And that's the challenge. That's what I've been on about for months and months on end. That for people to be able to do these, I have to be able to put the raw materials in their hands so that they can put time and energy and patience into it and be able to actually get something out of the outside. It's all fine to be like, you can buy on Amazon a soldering kit where you can build like a digital clock. I had one over on a table over there. You can buy the kit to build a digital clock. Unfortunately, when you do that, yes, you're spending only like $8, $14 or something like that for your digital clock. Then when you build it, you discover that it's got the worst, most garbage parts imaginable, and it's not terribly useful, and it's really kind of terrible. And once you finish making it, hopefully it works, even though, like, for at least for the one that I saw, the resistors, the circuit board in it are all absolute total garbage. So if it even works, now you have a really bad digital clock. This is not, it's like it's in the direction of being able to build your own synthesizers, but it's not building your own synthesizer. It's building a useless thing just because it's cheap and impossible to do. Hence my enthusiasm for all this. And that's what I'm on about. So let me have a look at chat there. Andy is asking, is there a way to make a band filter tilt EQ? Like, couldn't you combine EQs? Couldn't you combine things? Sometimes I'm a little baffled by the stuff that people ask, but it sounds like double entendre is on the money as far as what you would do. It is, you do a couple of instances of an EQ and then blend them. I think, in fact, I'm pretty sure that my biquad filters, and typically you can't sweep the biquad filters because they're meant to be fixed EQs, but if you need to do something like that, my biquad filters have dry wet, so you do have the capacity to sort of blend between two things. So you'd apply strong filters and then use the dry wet to sort of blend between them to some extent. That or just stack them. Like, if you don't want to have a blended softened effect, what you do is do the full-on tilt EQ and then do your full-on resonance on top of that, and do whatever you do. Gate on C-strip. That's a fair question. Let me take a minute and look it up. I don't think it is. I think that the gate on C-strip is not dissimilar to digital black, though. That said, it might not be exactly the same as digital black. I'm going and looking at it now. I suppose if I really wanted to, I could compare the two on stream, but it might get a little technical doing that. But yeah, I'm looking at the code now. In fact, I can share that. Let me see what I can do about that. Huh. Well, that's interesting. Oh, I see what happened. Just a minute. Crop to window. I have to specify a window. The window that I chose was not present. There we go. I am not at all sure if that's going to work. Let's find out. This is me just trying to get this working. So here's our code for C-strip. And you're asking, how's the gate different? Let's find out. The gate was right in the beginning. Okay. Git roller is part of the digital black code. That said, I am not sure. I'm wondering whether maybe this is something that I was thinking about fooling with, which is a gate that opens only at zero crossings. We do have a zero cross scenario in here. Oh no, wait, no, it is definitely this is digital black. This is not the gate that opens only at zero crossings I was thinking about. Not that that's not a good idea. Maybe that's something that I should do. But this is essentially digital black. What it's doing is it's doing a zero cross count when it changes polarity. And when the gate closes, the gate is going to close faster if frequencies are higher and it's crossing zero more often. If it's doing base frequencies, it will close slower to make that be more neatly. It doesn't want to mess with lower frequencies, and so the gate's going to operate differently. And it says, like here, there we go, end gate. That is essentially digital black. And I'll have to remember to fix this later when I go to that. I do not know, Andy, why your heart is racing when I say zero crossing. I'm sure there's some good reason for that. So the gate in C-strip, that is literally digital black code. So it might be implemented a teeny bit differently. I'm not absolutely certain that it's the same. I didn't take the time to grovel through both of the codes and find out if they were literally the same, but that is the digital black code. So digital black is a separate device. So you should look into that one. It's possible that that will meet your needs as far as getting a gate that works like the gate in C-strip. Because again, if that's not exactly digital black, then it's a simplification of digital black. Well, that's a fair point. I wouldn't write that out completely. Call it strip gate or something. One thing about, like, I think I do have a threshold control in the C-strip thing. It's not like just a gate that has no controls. I do love putting out plugins that have no controls, but I don't think it's quite like that. Very well. Here we have C-strip gate. It's a suggestion for another plugin that I can do. I will be looking for plugins that I can do, so that is all good and fine. Oh, I'm not lining it up very well. I also promised Bo that I was going to draw a picture of what Studio 10 did to make stuff bright. Lorenzo has a quick question. Is there an Airwindows plugin that makes bass more audible on small speakers? I would say not specifically, but there are a couple of candidates that are already out that you could look into. And here's one. There's a plugin called Floor. It's using processing specifically for that purpose. Floor is based on some of the old bass processor plugins, not necessarily by me. Like there's a Wave Max Bass thing or something like that, which, as near as I can tell, the idea behind that one was using second harmonics or something to simulate the sound of a lower octave. And I had a whack at seeing whether I could do that kind of stuff. So what Floor does And I wouldn't say that it was necessarily perfect, but it's got stuff going on with it. It's generating harmonics in such a way that it's rolling off the bass, but that's not necessarily going to make peak energy less, since when you filter stuff, sometimes you're rearranging the energy in ways that are not useful. But Floor acts like it is a adjustable high pass, but it's an adjustable high pass that has a weird resonant quality around the bottom of its range, and it would literally translate to making bass sound more audible on small speakers, at least to some extent. So look into the Floor plugin for that purpose. In more general sense, any distortion will do some of that. Any distortion, and like have you been listening to my plugin posts and stuff? Because some of your answer is right there. The bass guitar sounds that I use are incredibly mid-rangey and trebly, and in the mix they'll come across just fine. Almost all the time, if you have a full mix and you're trying to have a bass instrument in there doing something musically useful, if you soloed it, it wouldn't sound like a bass instrument so much anymore. And it takes dedicated genres to use bass that's both low and without overtones. Like if you're looking to do a bass that's really seriously just bass frequencies and it needs to sound super clean, you have to build that into the genre. You're doing something like reggae, you're doing something like dub. You're doing stuff where you're leaving a lot of space because high frequency and mid-range stuff will get in the way of being able to hear a pure, clean bass tone. So that's essentially how it works. That's an arrangement issue rather than a plugin issue. Oh, I've gone to the wrong camera, by the way. Hi, chat. You do exist. I just switched away from you. Sorry about that. So it really depends. It depends, like, what effect do you want to create or resemble? And how real of that effect do you want? In particular, it's very interesting as to, are you talking about an electric bass, or are you talking about synthesis of some kind? Or are you talking about basically straight up a test tone kind of sine frequency bass that is super, super, super clean? So Lorenzo says, yes, electric bass mostly. There's the thing. You can lose a lot of the fundamental tone out of the electric bass and build it up out of mid-range elements. Like, I've changed my Rickenbacker over my shoulder there around in a number of ways. Like, it's not a real Rick, so it started out not having the neck pickup, and so when I got it, somebody had already modified it. And I've modified it in the sense of I patched the output so that it has a stereo output, and the bridge and neck pickups each go to, it's like a stereo quarter inch. So bridge pickup is the tip, and then the neck pickup is the ring. And I can run through different things. And even then, I'm getting a better low frequency tone than I got on the one piece of music that I've been leaning on for months and months on end. I can get better sounds out of it through overdriving the neck pickup, through running it through some kind of amp-like thing. And getting an actual bass tone, which doesn't necessarily resemble a super heavy bass, I lean a lot on having mid-range overtones, having it not be too heavily filtered. when you use a sound that's like an incredibly heavy, thick bass tone, often that's about running into an amp and then into a speaker. And what that means, and there's actually a bass guitar speaker plugin that I could be putting some effort into doing, so Keb SVT, bother me for that one if you want a little help with this, because that is somewhat helpful too. But when you're using when I say not a real rig, it's like a 4000 or something, and it originally came with just the bridge pickup, and somebody modified it, meaning that it lost value. It doesn't have the original knobs. It's both the neck and the bridge, both the nut and the bridge are a little screwy, and they have bits of string holding the strings on properly. So it's real enough, it's just not a good one. It was relatively cheap to get for a rig. It is actually Rickenbacker, it's just not what it looks like. It's not really a 4001 or 4003. It was something else that didn't have all the pickups, and it's been modified, not by me, to have them. But yeah, part of getting a bass sound with articulation and the correct attitude is including some overtones and some distortion, and cut back on some of the extreme lows rather than just letting it through. You're looking for sort of like low mid resonances to get that going on. Now, before it scrolls off of the screen and we talk about bass more, Canvy Audio asks, will you ever make my own version of the Soothe plugin? That's a really specific plugin, and no. And it's not because I'm so opposed to AI type stuff, although I'm pretty opposed to AI type stuff. I'm opposed to the concept of what it does. I think it's a mistake. I think it will hurt you rather than help you. Like Soothe, although you could manipulate it in various ways, but on the one hand, it is this, it's a, I'm trying to think of that type of filter. It breaks stuff down into FFT bins, fast Fourier transform bins, adjusts them individually using, AI is putting that strongly too. That's not really AI, that's just a clever algorithm. Given the FFT bins, you can figure stuff like that out. People have been doing stuff like that for a long time. You can do stuff not too dissimilar from Soothe with Tom Irby's old plugin SoundHack. SoundHack is loaded with FFT tricks. And when people get all excited about Soothe, it is because it is doing something that's not necessarily going to help your mix. It is breaking down sounds into FFT bands and identifying harmonics and overtones that are sticking out and being amplified, and essentially compressing them in the most fundamental technique for how that works. So essentially it's just like a compressor, but it's the compressor that's only stepping on the overtones, but the overtones are where all of the definition of your sound comes from. So I get when like annoying, I mean, when you talk about Soothe, basically what you're talking about is my bass sound has irritating overtones, probably in the highs, because I don't hear a lot of talk about, oh, Soothe helped me fix the honking bass resonance in my lows. Soothe helped me take away the wah pedal that I applied to my guitar, and now it doesn't sound like it's a wah pedal anymore. Instead, Soothe is typically turned to like a magic bullet for stuff where, I've recorded a sound and there's something grating and annoying about the highs here. And that's to some extent legitimate. I just don't think it's necessarily, it's like overkill. It's like peeling an apple by throwing it into a food processor. You don't have peel, but now you have applesauce. It is like a billion multiband compressors all on top of each other. And that's more complicated than I like. That is, I have a style of DSP, and that's not it. And in circumstances where you would look for soothe because it is the magic bullet, where immediately, the highs aren't grading anymore, I have a bunch of different plugins for that specific purpose. You could turn to like running things through my most recent version of channel. You could do a capacitor too and then trap in the extremes a little bit. You could, if you wanted to keep stuff really clean and still take away the annoying overtones, acceleration. You could go with acceleration. You could go with dBass. It's the most advanced version of my de-esser, and experiment with either intense versions of dBass or toning it down until it's like bleeding off a lot more of the highs. And that would be as close as I get to doing specifically what Soothe normally does for people. In the circumstances where it's like, okay, Soothe for mid-range sonority, those are the circumstances where I think, no, you shouldn't do that. That is what makes your mix work. So I feel like as far as Soothe, people always come back. I think partly because I'm putting out free plugins. Soothe is not a free plugin. So people would really like to get Soothe from me so that they don't have to pay money for it. But that's the thing, is I work on solving the problems that are addressed by Soothe, but I do that in a different way. Oh yeah, the most recent raw glitters in D-Res mode is definitely reverse soothe. It's the least soothing sound you could imagine. So yeah. That is me trying to do a more elaborate explanation around the topic of why won't you make us a soothe? Because I gotta say, has it been years? Have people been begging me for a knockoff of this particular, very branded, very identifiable, very somebody else's property plugin for years? I feel like people have been asking me for this one for literally years now. Has it been out for years? I really don't know. But that's the thing. It's like if you ask me for a Butterworth filter, I've already got one. It's biquad. There's a number of things like that. There are generic things. Ask me for a compressor. I've got like 6. You ask me for a soothe, and that's not even like asking me for a Neve. That's somebody's special DSP. It's not even just a tone of something that exists already. It's something it is a little special. I don't like what it does. I often don't approve what it does. I like accomplishing the things that it accomplishes in different ways, but that's legit. There's a reason why people are so fixated on this, is you don't just get that out of the stock DAW plugins. It's something else. It's very easy and convenient. You don't even really have to think about it. It just kind of magically associates itself with whatever is going on and goes like, okay, clean that up for you. I just feel like some of the things that I do, like acceleration, like DS or dBass, various things like that are better at what Soothe does. You just have to use a little more skill in doing them. And that's kind of where I stand with it, is this complicated and very full of sauce and argument response. Because it's like, on the one hand, I'd rather tell you about a bunch of ways that you should be doing that purpose better. It's like having a magic preset machine for equalizing instruments that if you made the thing which is like, listen to my track and think to yourself about what EQ preset among these 652 that is built into the plugin we should use, you could make something that does that. It's even a little bit Soothe-like. But I think it's a terrible idea. Why do you don't want that. Please don't want that thing. There's so much more to do, and there is real downsides to steering in that direction, because what's going to happen is the audio that you create is going to be dictated by somebody's very generic notion of how things should be. And the more effective it is at being able to mangle stuff into whatever form seems basically correct, the more effective it is at doing that, the more it's going to take away from what you bring to the experience. So it's essentially like, are you doing music because you care about it, or are you doing music because you're trying to pretend? Well, and then even then, I started this whole conversation out talking about grip. And what I meant was there was a guy on a subreddit who was scorning the filmmaking job of being a grip. And it's kind of that sort of thing that I object to. But at the same time, when you're just one person and you wrote a song and you're a good songwriter and you're an okay guitar player, you're a really good singer, and you want to be heard, to some extent it's not really fair to go, you also have to learn to become a real sound engineer. So kind of there it is. To the extent that we don't cooperate with each other, to the extent that you don't find a person who's able to do the mixing or whatever for you, and you don't end up looking for Sooth because you run across somebody, there's probably many people like me, where they're like, dude, I would never use that. I like using, say, analog EQ, or I know exactly what I'm doing with my bands of EQ, and I would never turn it over to a, quote, AI, unquote. But if you don't know anybody with that kind of confidence, and if you don't want to learn how to make sound do things, then I see a purpose there. But what I don't see is where it's my place to get involved and make a free knockoff of that tool just so that people can do it. Honestly, I feel like if you want that, you should be using Sooth and not asking me about it, because you're looking for something. And Andy is mentioning DSeek 2. Somebody over there is hell-bent on beating Sooth at what Sooth does. I'm not surprised. I'm not the bit surprised. And I feel that that's going to lead to just a pile of like stuff that claims that it's AI, that is promising the world, promising that if you come and you want to be a musician, then you can just like belch into the microphone a little bit and it's going to make magic come out. And what's really going to come out is a bunch of very generic production. But that has its place. I don't like the place, but it's a place. And in a sense, I'm pleased about that, because then you turn around and you've got people building crazy circuitry and their own synthesizers, which are like labeled with bits of electrical tape like this, and using these things, and they're building some kind of strange monstrosity. So when you hear what they do, it sounds original. It doesn't sound like anything else you've heard. And it sounds big and alive, because a lot of the stuff that I make in terms of talking about these things and designing this type of stuff, there's a reason why I keep going on about the jacks and the cables and things. Like when I talk about that stuff, this is some of the things that I've learned over years of experimenting and also doing digital audio. This gets into the reason why I can make plugins that don't sound like Sooth or anything else, really. There's a real reason for that stuff. I've talked about this before. Like when you do knockoffs of things like old Moog synthesizers, I've owned the Behringer Model D. And I thought that it was surprisingly good. And then I opened it up and I realized that the way that it was built, it was able to be surprisingly good, surprisingly close to what a real Model D would be doing. And that's because it's analog circuitry that's built a certain way. It's built so that the wires and switches and things in the signal path are fairly substantial. This is also how I have some guitar boxes, some guitar stomp boxes, like my Beano Boost. I've got an Analog Man Beano Boost. You can build stuff like that if you have the parts and know what you're doing for very cheaply. The Beano Boost, its internal stuff is very much like built on a piece of perf board like this. It doesn't even have a circuit board because it's point-to-point wiring inside. And the capacitors and resistors and things are just wired to each other and to the controls. This is similar to the ways that like the old Moog modulars were built, where the old Moog modulars were rather large. They took up a lot of space, and the circuitry was very similar to like what you used to get out of ENIAC or whatever, giant old tube monstrosities with these huge circuit boards where the wires from one place to another are these traces that are like a 1/4 inch wide or more, and they're tinned with solder on them, which I think is probably for reliability purposes. But the bottom line is old school electronics of the kind that people call vintage and special and magical is made with like beefy, heavy wire connectivity where it's capable of handling energy way beyond what you would imagine is being put through it. And when we go to stuff like this, and this also gets you to be farther away from things like Sooth. Yeah, no, don't worry about it. I'm just on a rant. It's nothing personal. It's just something that comes up. The thing about building gear, like hardware like this, is what I'm proposing is putting stuff together with 20 gauge solid steel wire, attaching all the bits, and particular kind of IC socket for how you sort of patch stuff together. It's not convenient to do it that way. It is kind of micro miniaturized, so that's useful. But it's not convenient compared to like full-size cables. It's way, way cheaper, and the connections that you use by plugging these wires into these particular kinds of sockets can handle amperes of power. Like, they're very small connections, but this is the same kind of connection that you use to power a CPU in a personal computer when it's pulling enough energy that you have to use multiple fans and elaborate cooling systems to keep the CPU from melting. And this is the same basic principle as to where it gets all that power. So basically, when you have the difference between something like an Analog Man Beano Boost that's all point-to-point hardwired and a lot of modern guitar pedals and things that don't have nearly as big and full a sound, is that there are a lot of modern guitar pedals and things that are using modern computer and cell phone style circuit design. And by that I mean you got your guitar jack and it's going into a circuit board, but the circuit board is itself like this. Now the deal with this is it's okay with it being a circuit board because it's mostly a computer. And the output is one of these pins, and it's somewhat limiting having the output be on just one of those pins, but you don't really mind it so much. But if everything is this big, including all your analog circuitry, the sound starts getting really tiny. And if you're running stuff like this, your output is from here, and everything in your analog circuitry is heavy cables and big old capacitors and things. Like in the vintage days, you wind up getting a pretty huge sound out of a tiny thing like this. It is, this is just, I don't know what to tell you. I'm just off on a rant here. I'm getting down to like the last 15 minutes or so of my stream today, so it's like I should refocus myself on answering questions if anybody wants to shoot more questions out. I do see that Bo is quickly here. Let me scroll for a bit. And he's going, can you do a list of songs to find the best mixed example of that genre? Not really. What I like to do is go by the evergreens concept. I feel that best mixed, when you look at sales over time, great music that's also great mixed tends to sell for longer. It stays popular for longer. This is kind of broken down in recent years when things just become about promotion. But my evergreen study was all about looking at the stuff that just continued to sell over the years. And I've done evergreens podcasts on things like the Beatles' White Album and so on and so forth, finding that there were common factors among a lot of that stuff. I've talked about that before. Bo's asking, what's the plugin that I mentioned that works similarly to Soothe? I don't know. I don't really pay attention to that stuff. Lorenzo just heard about the Basecamp BST. Fair enough. Let me double write that down. That one. Do I really like the idea of a channel strip? Your DAW is the channel strip. That's kind of the whole point. Like, you can see behind me that I have a modular synthesizer. That's where my heart really lies. That's the strength of a DAW. The strength of a DAW is being able to patch all different kinds of stuff in there rather than having a fixed and organized set of things. That said, like, the DAW is your modular synthesizer. Your entire mix is a modular synthesizer, but your I'm thinking about preset, and that's not the word. Your template is your channel strip. So it's really important to be able to design your own template rather than being stuck with whatever somebody makes for whatever your music is. It's really important to be able to design your own template in the DAW, start out with that, and kind of go with it. That is your channel strip, because that's how your music begins to come into focus, and you know how you normally organize your sounds. Because all the channel strip is a mixing board that's been organized in a particular way. I feel that's a fairly important concept, because otherwise you wind up being like, how can I model? And I can do some of those things, but they're not the fastest thing that I try to do. You end up modeling like, this is a set of plugins and you should set them up exactly like this, and then it's like this mixing console. And to an extent, it's like, why? Somebody's made that sound already. And if the answer is because it's an amazing sound and I love that sound, that's fair. But there is still a degree, like the freedom that we have in the computer, the bonuses that we get out of the price that we pay from having stuff be a little bit degraded, working with the digital and having a kind of a road through various kinds of distortions. The bonus we get is that we could have any form of mixing board or any kind of, we can imagine any damn thing that we want. It's just a question of, are we going to do it, or can somebody inspire us to do something interesting like that? And can we get something out of it, or can we communicate it in some way? Because it's also a little bit like, productivity gurus, folks who are like, I'm going to do a podcast and it'll teach everybody how to be organized and get their work done. And you can spend years following stuff like that and not doing anything. And it's also like, I don't know, I played a bunch of Minecraft for a while. It's also like Minecraft. You can spend a lot of time chopping wood and punching through stone with your fist, and it's not really. It's just images on a screen. It's an imaginary thing. You can save it as a file, and it's this big pile of ones and zeros, and that's all it really is. But then if you go into it in the right context, it looks and acts and feels kind of like it's a place or a thing or something that you made. All of this can be very subjective. So yeah, let's continue looking at that. Yeah. Canvy, I hope that you don't feel that I'm being real cross with you. It's not really that. It's just that the topic itself always is interesting for me to talk about. Oh, Lorenzo has a quick question. Bit-shift gain. Is bit-shift gain suited for automation? Nah. You could automate it because it's nothing but a gain with only a set number of options. It'll only pick options that let you alter the exponent and not touch the mantissa of the audio. So it's only a fixed set of multiplications or divisions. But you could automate it. It would depend upon, I guess, what you were trying to do. Like, it can only automate in 6 dB increments. That's all there is to it. Andy is going, build an original amp, Chris, and teach me how to do it. You're on. I will. That might be the first thing that I do, because the thing is, if I build that, stomp box thing, which is, I'm staring at this one thing all this time. If I build that stomp box thing, which is like one chip on a piece of this with a power supply that connects to it somehow, and then you run audio in and connect it to something, you can connect that to a speaker, and until the chip blows up and melts, it makes a sound. So it's like an original amp. And even more than that, if you have one stage of amplification, there's all kinds of weird things you can do. So it becomes a matter of like, oh, you want the amp that's like bright and chimey and jangly? Well, we can wire it up like this. Or if you want it to be like thicker and beefier, well, we'll wire it up like this. You start experimenting with stuff, and it might not be a quote-unquote real amp that you plug in, go on stage with. But there are a lot of ways around that. I have some chips that I got, and I'm trying to remember how many of them I got. I think I got a limited number of them. But you can get a chip for, I think it was just a couple of bucks. It's a 15-watt amplifier IC. And I think it might even be a Class D amplifier. And when you get into stuff like that, that's trickier to wire up than just the tube sound fuzz stuff. Because the tube sound fuzz that I'm so pleased with, that is nothing but a inverter stage and doctoring that to pass audio signals. And it's really primitive, and it's really fun and nice. And when you do that, the way that chip works automatically gives you super soft, like density style saturation. It might look like a chip, it might look like a transistor, but it doesn't sound anything like one. And that means you can run multiple stages and get high gain with no aliasing, because it's analog, and a lovely, soft, juicy sort of tone. And if you want to go a step beyond that, I know which FETs, which field effect transistors, isolated transistors that you can use to build that stuff out of individual components rather than a chip. And that can produce even better effects. It's just harder. If you're doing individual transistors, you wind up being stuck with figuring out how they work and wiring all these resistors up. So it's like, okay, this has to sit here and the signal comes here, and I have to have a resistor here to ground, and I have to have another resistor here to the voltage so that goes into the, it gets biased in the middle and all of this stuff. You got to figure that stuff out or fake it. The great thing is you can fake it. You can wire stuff like that up relatively at random and get weird, interesting results. This is how some of the boutique boutique stomp box makers do their thing. Like, I know which transistors Devi Ever likes. And it's not just because it's not just like stealing the Devi Ever transistors. She was picking transistors because it's like, this has the best high gain, this has the best this and that, and so on and so forth. And you don't get to randomly choose another transistor and have it be acceptable. Sometimes you just have to pick up on like, yeah, let's build some stuff using these transistors, and let's not just straight up copy the schematic, but let's make something else. And then you start getting stuff that acts like building an amp from scratch. Build an original amp and teach me how to do it is very possible. That's kind of where I'm heading with all this. Charles Knudsen is saying, I've been working on a drum synth off an Axolotl. Hell yeah. I am very fond of Axolotl. I've got a bunch of them. I never use them as much as I should. That is a $70 thing that you can get, that you can plug into the computer and do a lot of cool and interesting stuff with. And the neat thing about Axolotl is that it also has analog inputs and outputs, so you can use it on things like guitars, or use it as a processor for, I think it does stereo in and out. You can use it as a processor for your whole mix or whatever. Use it as outboard gear. And to the extent that it's capable of doing good DSP, its converters, the Axolotl's converters are really quite good. It's 24-bit, it's like 48K. Technically, the hardware is capable of better, but the Axolotl never went beyond 48K. But the sound of the ADC and DAC in the Axolotl is really quite good compared to a lot of other stuff. It's a different approach from like these, from the Teensy. The Teensy you can make sound wonderful by just jacking up the sample rate to insanely high. It's still very low bit, but it stops mattering. The Axolotl doesn't have a jacked up sample rate, so it sounds decent when you use good components inside it. When you use the DSP objects that it makes possible. There are people out there that are making really, really great DSP objects for the Axolotl. Like if you wanted to generate synthesizers and be like, let's have an outboard box that sounds like Serum. Let's have an outboard box that sounds like a digital synth with a really, really super lush and fat tone. Axolotl will do that for you if you know where to look. Some of the tone generators, some of the oscillators that you can get in the Axolotl are so well designed, and they're going to be using the same tricks that these boutique expensive keyboards use on a $70 board. So strongly, strongly advised. Ahmed Said Anand is in the music theory business for now, so no new songs. That's fair. I'm in a variety of businesses, and everybody can see that I don't do all that much as far as cutting new songs and things. There will come a time, but it's fairly obvious that like I'm working on new things, and I have to do stuff like get cameras and make that stuff work. And I feel that like if I start soldering something over here, I feel like that's gonna work. Like I'll be able to do this work not too inconveniently, and you'll be able to see what I'm doing. So if I do that properly, I think I'm getting ready to launch into that world. EB, if you should choose one piece of gear to buy. What is it? I'm tempted to say a good digital to analog converter or good amplifier monitoring. Monitoring helps you when you're learning how to do this kind of stuff. It will open up a whole world for you. And being able to hear what you're working on. I'm assuming that we're still talking about DAWs and working in the audio. I would focus on that kind of thing, yeah. I'm Andy's DIY guru now. I'm going to build whatever you build. Well, I'm literally trying to set up to be able to make that possible. All this stuff, I've got so much of this perf board stuff. I'm getting all of this stuff together specifically so that I can be like, okay, guys, we're open for business. Throw me like $11 or something that will cover the cost at bulk rates of this bit and this bit and this bit and this bit and that bit. And then you would have this stuff at home. You'd need to get your own soldering iron. Hopefully that would be possible, but hopefully it would be really exciting. And the nice thing about it is if I communicate which parts I am using, you don't necessarily have to wait for me. I will happily point you to the Mouser Electronics page where you get this particular chip that I use, or All Electronics where I'll be getting my wire, or anything like that. And I'm trying to get a bunch more of this electrical tape that has such good colors on it because I think that's very useful. And everybody should be able to be a synth builder. That's where I got started with this stuff. EB is saying, did I isolate my pickups and wires in my guitars? It depends. Generally, I'm building my own guitars and things. There's a video that I did where I was, if I'm not mistaken, rickizing a Squier jazz bass. I think that it feels like that's what I did. So I had this jazz bass and I was changing the ways that the pickups were mounted and stuff so that the bridge pickup was going through a capacitor, and I called that rickizing the thing. Wasn't really true. I didn't have the same sound off of the body of the bass. It's not built out of the same kinds of wood, so on and so forth, but it was a kind of DIY guitar and bass hacking thing. It depends. Like, when isolate is not really a useful word in terms of pickups and wires. That sounds like it would be like, did you leave them not connected to anything? Maybe you're thinking in terms of shielding them. Some of my instruments have shielded wires and some of them don't. Like the Telecaster, which is real Telecaster parts, but they're all garbage. At least the guy that put it together thought they were all garbage. I think it's wonderful. But that has just bare wires going from the pickups to everything. And the metal of the pickguard part kind of shields it. Some of the instruments have shielded wires, and some of them are just big, heavy wires going from the pickups to the parts. And that's part of what gets their sound. Sometimes the ones that have a really vibey, classic kind of sound, it's like I was saying about the old synthesizers. Big honking wires putting these things together. And it helps them sound more open compared to little tiny delicate heavily shielded wires that can only carry the tiniest little voltages, like wires that you get off of a set of cheap headphones that you got in Walmart or whatever. You can pass signal through that kind of stuff. You can pass enough signal that it's a speaker. Those tiny little headphones, little like earbuds and such that you get for really cheaply in a place like Walmart or Amazon or something like that. The wires that you have in those are way more delicate than even what you get in guitars. And they're passing more energy. They're passing enough energy to drive a speaker. But it's kind of limiting. So, Lorenzo, yeah, I think I saw something about that. The important thing here is that you need to not worry about that. You don't need my permission, and you certainly don't need my permission to say, oh, hey, I'm using this because, dude, think about it. Like, first of all, who's to say whether your mix sucks or not? That's not necessarily mine to say. Second of all, what's wrong with helping somebody make a mix even if it sucks? That's kind of important. It matters to me that I'm making tools available to people, whether they have like a record company's resources and tens of thousands of dollars behind them or not. Like if you're worried that your song sucks, maybe it's because you haven't been making music for long and you're learning how to do your stuff. And how are you supposed to do that without tools? It's really important that you have access to this stuff. And hopefully that you haven't been nickeled and dimed away by people who are just selling you gear to telling you that that's what makes you good. So I would, don't worry about it. And of course you can credit Airwindows on it. I don't care what kind of, there are kinds of music that people make that I would find distressing, but mostly because they were claiming or demanding things and have a message that doesn't speak for me. But as far as using my plugins, dude, it wouldn't matter who you were, or what you were up to, or even what you believed, or what your lyrics were about, or any of that. It's like, nope, I make tools available for a reason. And there's no reason to restrict that, and you don't need my okay to do it. So there's no such thing as decent enough to credit Airwindows on it. Basically, that would be saying, you too could get this. And that's really important. That's like the punk ethos back in the day when, a band would get together and they'd put out a record because they'd heard that this was a way of doing things. And the first record they put out, this is a real band. I think it's like one of the early synth rock guys, or certainly the early DIY folks. And they did a band that, a record that sounded like complete garbage because they didn't know what microphones really were. So it's just these folks in a living room jamming away, and like the microphone is in the adjacent room or something. It's just somewhere, and their lyrics are going like, "It was easy, it was cheap, you can do it." I don't remember the exact band, like the Insane Bicycles or something like that, but that was the lyrics of their song, is about how to make a song and how to put out a record. And they're like, and we did this thing, and we put out a record, and this is a record, and it was easy, it was cheap, you can do it. That's the song. That's the song. I love that. I think that's really cool. So yeah, you surely will, Van? Surely do. Andy is headed out, and Easel Weasel has showed up. Okay. So do we have any other? This is meant to be a Q&A, although typically I'm just talking and people don't like fire questions at me all the time. And sometimes when they do, they're dismayed at the answers that I get. Like when people are constantly asking me to do a sooth. You're always going to get a saucy answer from me from that. And it's partly because I don't like what the plugin does, and it's partly because I'm being asked to do somebody's DSP idea that's kind of original-ish. It's maybe not totally original, but it's kind of original-ish, so I feel kind of like they should be allowed to have that one. But, yeah. Oh, so you were checking out Crush Roll Boxes. Cool. I hope you had fun. That's like a lifetime of weird music of various kinds. Honestly, that, Lorenzo should listen to Crush Roll Boxes. You have no idea what garbage music I've made at times. Some of that stuff is really weird, or sounds really bad, or just doesn't make any sense. And it's like, well, I did that stuff too. Do I know that is releasing those songs? There they are. I don't talk about them generally, but there they are. As far as releasing those songs, you'd have to tell me what you expected to have done with them other than that. And I can't begin to guess which ones you think are gems, because the thing about Crush All Boxes, that is my entire life of making music in one way or another. It started out when I was making music on literal cassette decks. There's stuff in there that was recorded onto literal cassette tapes that I still have. And the only reason you have them on there is because I digitized them at some point. Some of the really old Apple GS music, like the Dragons album. No. The Postcards from Tahik album, in which Dragons is a track on it. That is an Apple II GS doing computer music recorded on a crappy boombox. And that's all that ever was. And then there were albums like I mentioned, the Dragons album. You might think of that as one of the gems because I put a lot of effort into it. That was when I had an ADAT. So that is decidedly pre-DAW. That's like back when the computers were 33 megahertz, 68K all-in-one Mac with the screen built into it. In fact, the MIDI of the Dragons album was sequenced off of that antique Mac that ran at 33 megahertz. There's just a bunch of different things. The Room Full of Windows album, which actually has songs but is incredibly old, that's also a 4-track cassette recording. And there was an attempt at making songs that was in the ADAT time period. Most of Crush All Boxes is all pre-DAW. It's all stuff that existed before we even had computers that could do music. So in a lot of ways, it's all kind of weird and strange, but again, you talk about gems and it's impossible to tell what you mean. The album Cirrus is like more or less grating and kind of bright ambient synth music, and that is also ADAT. It's also 8-track bad early digital. And the synthesizers are all an old miniature Korg, just this tiny little thing with a resonant filter in it, and doing weird stuff with that, and with bizarre circuitry that I built. There is an entire album called Hard Vacuum. That's the same name as one of the plugins. The Hard Vacuum album is entirely made up out of shortwave radio over a shortwave receiver, which I think I still have. I haven't done much with it. That's run into a circuit. Let's boop over to here again. No computers, but a circuit that's built using exactly this type of technology. And the Hard Vacuum album runs the shortwave receiver through a 3-band equalizer compressor distorter, basically a multi-band EQ / distortion / compressor that is built out of 404 hex inverter chips and a bunch of wires and capacitors and potentiometers and things, such as that as a potentiometer. And it's all point-to-point wiring. In fact, I can't actually grab it now. On my Instagram is a picture of the remains of that device that I built. So that entire album is roaring noise music, like Merzbow style, just straight up noise. Just this explosion of static and interference and shortwave radio broadcasts and stuff. Super, super aggressive. Except for when it's running into the EQ, that's just rumbling because I've rolled off all the highs or something like that, and I'm just wrenching the knobs around and doing stuff. And I built that device. I built the EQ that Hard Vacuum is run through. And I just captured it. I think that's one of the ones that I captured to a computer, because I don't think Yeah, it was an early direct capture to a computer because I don't think I captured that one to ADAT. And this is partly why I'm trying to get other people to do this kind of thing. It's been a while since I've done that, but that was, oh geez, like must have been 20 years ago or so. And having built the bizarre EQ device that I did hard vacuum on and wrenched around all the controls and did all the like, if you think there are some gems on there and that's one of the ones that stood out to you, this is why I'm so excited about this hardware plan, is because other people can do this too. And all you need is a soldering iron and some solder and then enough guidance to be off and running. So Joku Sekavan is, and I always wonder whether I've got the syllables in the right place. Apple II, like PC speaker quality, could have played digital samples. Kinda. It was one of yours, like the Apple II GS is what I was doing that album on. The Apple II GS had a primitive Ensoniq chip, which was kind of like what you get out of an Amiga or something. It was one of those ones that had, I don't remember the name of this particular mode, but there's a whole series of synthesizers or like little sequencers and things that run on this one chip, and the Apple II GS had one of them. It couldn't really play digital samples, but it was a little more sophisticated than like your original Nintendo's sound chip. And it was an Ensoniq chip of some kind. And now I'm going to look it up. By God, it's getting a little bit late. I should be heading off, but I'm going to take a moment to look this up. Ensoniq Apple II GS sound chip. I misspelled it, but that's fine. Haha. Wikipedia for the Apple II GS has everything I would want to know about it. So here we go. It was a 2.8 megahertz microprocessor at 16 bits, so that's kind of cool. Faster than the original Apple II. And the Apple II GS contained, let's see now, the Ensoniq 5503 digital oscillator chip. I wonder if I, yeah. So it's similar but not exactly the same as the famous SID chip used in the Commodore 64. So that's what we're talking about. So essentially this album that I did, it might have been one of the albums that Easel was like, oh, there's some gems in there. That might have been one of the places where it's like, I haven't heard that before. And it's a Apple II GS playing through a chip that's not wildly different from the SID synthesizer chip used in the Commodore 64. And it's the 2GS sound chip is the same chip used in the Ensoniq Mirage and the Ensoniq ESQ1. Although the Wikipedia does say citation needed, which is fair. I wouldn't be surprised though. That seems legit. So there you have it. So yeah, those songs are already released. That is where they are. If nobody hears about them, that's kind of what happens to most music. So whatever. I'm more interested in what further music I can do, which is ambitious for like an over 50-year-old old fart. But what the hell? I do feel like I can probably think of something cool to do. And I'll be more excited about that than reprocessing, because I spent too many years wanting to reprocess the stuff that I had done at some point in the past. Now that stuff just sits on the Crush All Boxes website. And I'm happy that you like some of it. But the Apple II GS, that you could sequence stuff using something that was like MIDI but not really a MIDI sequencer. And then the 2GS had its own sound chip, which was like the NSYNC Mirage or the ESQ1, which I think is probably that sounds accurate. Those professional synthesizers were early digital, so they might have been doing polyphony and having more of these chips in there, but honestly it does sound very similar. And both the NSYNC Mirage and the ESQ1 use these tone generator chips, much like the 2GS, and it's stuff like, you can get stuff like this to also spit out the same kinds of sounds. Like, you don't have to have the exact Commodore 64 chip, you can just do something like it. But then the ESQ1 and possibly the Mirage also were running analog filtering. So this is all stuff that you can do. We'll be talking about this in the future. And Easel says the HTML makes it hard to access it easily while commuting. That's fair. It's not really meant to be a streaming site or anything like it, because I feel like a lot of that doesn't really rate that. But it's fairly, like, if you can dig into the HTML and like look at it in developer tools or whatever, it links directly to all the files, and I have no problem with you downloading all the files and having them. So it's like Crush All Box's website is pirate heaven. Just go and look up the links and grab the direct files and have those. And then, it doesn't have to be on my website either, as far as if people actually started listening to that stuff. I would just assume that they DL'd them. The only reason it doesn't have DL links built into it is because I was keeping the interface super minimal, and arguably a mistake, but I made that years ago, and haven't really seen fit to do anything with it ever since. So on that note, I think I'm going to bid you folks adieu. I've run over time a little bit, but I got excited and started talking about all this hardware stuff and got carried away. So on that note, I will, fool with some of these things, and I'll talk to you guys next week if I don't end up doing something sooner than a little hard to tell, but we shall see. So on that note, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.